Thanksgiving. The one day a year where we're supposed to gather around a table, enjoy a meal, and remind ourselves of what we're thankful for. Sounds simple, right? Well, not when my family's involved. Let me start by saying, I've always loved the idea of Thanksgiving. The food, the warmth, the laughter, it always seemed like such a wholesome tradition. But for most of my life, I've been a guest at someone else's table, usually my mom's or my aunt's. This year, though, I decided to take on the mantle myself. I'm 34, I have my own place, and I thought, why not? How hard can it be? Spoiler alert, harder than I thought. I spent weeks planning. I scoured Pinterest for recipes, watched hours of YouTube tutorials on the perfect turkey brine, and even practiced making pies in advance because I was determined that everything would be flawless. I wanted my first Thanksgiving as host to be special, memorable, not just for me but for my family, too. I wanted them to walk away thinking, wow, she really nailed it. Now, let me paint a quick picture of my family dynamics. My family is, let's say, diverse in their opinions. On one side, you have my uncle, who might as well have Fox News enthusiast tattooed on his forehead. On the other side, there's my cousin, who is basically the human embodiment of a Twitter activist. And then there's me, somewhere in the middle, leaning left but trying not to rock the boat too much because, well, it's family. My goal was simple, keep things civil for one day. When the big day came, I woke up at the crack of dawn, full of energy and excitement. The turkey went in the oven right on schedule, the sides were prepped, the pies were cooling on the counter. It was like something out of a Norman Rockwell painting. By the time my first guests arrived, I was beaming. My mom came in first, immediately giving me that approving mom look like, wow, you really did all this? My chest swelled with pride. This was my moment. For the first 15 minutes, everything was perfect. People admired the setup, commented on how great the house smelled, and complimented my efforts. I even managed to catch a few smiles from my usually grumpy uncle. I thought, this is it. This is the Thanksgiving I've always dreamed of. But, of course, it couldn't last. It started small. My uncle made an offhand comment, something about how woke people probably think Thanksgiving is offensive now. It was such a throwaway remark that I almost let it slide. Almost. I rolled my eyes but kept my mouth shut because I was determined not to let anything ruin the vibe. But then my cousin, who has never met a comment she didn't want to clap back at, couldn't resist. She shot back with something like, maybe because it is offensive if you actually think about history for more than 2 seconds. And just like that, the atmosphere shifted. You could feel it in the room, like the air got heavier. My uncle, never one to back down from a challenge, laughed and said, oh, here we go. Tell me more about how I'm a terrible person for celebrating a holiday. I jumped in, trying to steer the conversation away. Hey, did everyone see the sweet potato casserole? I tried a new recipe. But no one was listening. The tension was like a fire, and every word they exchanged was gasoline. Before I knew it, they were in a full-blown argument, their voices rising with every passing second, each more determined to outdo the other. My uncle was on one of his familiar rants about cancel culture, leaning forward in his chair, gesturing with his hands like he was delivering a speech at a rally. His tone dripped with mockery and condescension, every word designed to provoke. It's like you can't even sneeze these days without someone being offended, he scoffed. People don't want traditions anymore, they want to rewrite history and make everyone feel guilty for things that happened hundreds of years ago. My cousin, never one to back down, leaned in just as intently, her voice cutting through his like a sharp blade. Maybe because some of those traditions are rooted in oppression, she shot back, her words measured and deliberate. Just because it's comfortable for you doesn't mean it's harmless for everyone else. But of course, that's not something you'd bother to think about. Her eyes flashed as she spoke, her tone unwavering. It was clear she was ready to keep going, to dismantle his argument piece by piece if she had to. The rest of the family sat in varying degrees of discomfort, their gazes darting between my uncle and cousin like they were watching a particularly tense tennis match. My mom shifted awkwardly in her seat, clearly wishing she could be anywhere else. My aunt busied herself smoothing invisible wrinkles in her napkin, avoiding eye contact entirely. No one said a word to intervene, not even a half-hearted attempt to calm things down. It was as though we were all collectively paralyzed, each of us silently hoping the storm would pass on its own. I tried again to redirect the conversation, clinging to the increasingly slim hope that I could salvage the moment. "So, how about the football game later?" I said, forcing a bright, cheerful tone that felt unnatural even to me. My voice was swallowed by the tension in the room. Not a single person responded. The arguing continued unabated, their voices overlapping now, each talking over the other in a crescendo of frustration and self-righteousness. At this point, my patience was wearing dangerously thin. I had spent days planning and preparing for this meal, perfecting recipes, setting the table just so, cleaning every corner of my house. I had envisioned this day as warm and joyful, filled with laughter and gratitude. Instead, it was being hijacked by their petty bickering, and it felt like all my hard work was being overshadowed. I could feel the annoyance building in my chest, heavy and suffocating, threatening to boil over. Then, just when I thought it couldn't get worse, my uncle turned his attention to me. He leaned back in his chair, smirking in that infuriating way he does when he thinks he's about to deliver the ultimate zinger. "I'm surprised you even wanted to host Thanksgiving," he said, his voice dripping with faux curiosity. "What with all your liberal ideas and whatnot? Don't you think it's problematic? Or did you finally come to your senses?" The words hit me like a slap. I wasn't even part of their argument, but somehow, I had become the target. My face flushed hot with a mix of embarrassment and anger. I could feel all eyes in the room shift to me, waiting to see how I would respond. For a moment, I considered taking the high road, brushing off his comment like it didn't bother me. But the truth was, it did bother me, a lot. I had worked so hard to create this day, this moment, and now I was being mocked in my own home. I forced a smile, my voice tight as I said, "Can we not do this right now? I just want everyone to enjoy the food." I hoped that would be enough to defuse the situation, to steer the conversation back to neutral ground. But, of course, my uncle wasn't done. He never is. "What?" he said, feigning innocence. "I'm just saying, people like you are the ones ruining traditions. Can't even have a holiday anymore without someone making it political." His smirk widened as a few people chuckled nervously, their laughter more about easing the tension than agreeing with him. Finally, I snapped. I stood up and said, "All right, that's enough. If you can't respect me or my home, you can leave." My voice was firm, but inside I was shaking. My uncle laughed again, this time louder. "Oh, the Thanksgiving police are here." More laughter. I looked around the room, waiting for someone, anyone, to have my back, but everyone just looked uncomfortable. That's when I lost it. I marched over to the coat rack, grabbed my uncle's jacket, and thrust it into his hands. "I'm serious. If you can't behave, you're not welcome here." There was a stunned silence. My mom tried to calm me down. "Sweetie, let's not overreact." But I was past the point of no return. "No, Mom. I spent days preparing this. I invited you all into my home, and this is how you repay me. If you can't show a little respect, then you can leave." And leave they did. One by one, I handed out coats, practically herding them out the door. Even the family members who weren't involved in the argument left because, honestly, what were they supposed to do? Sit there and pretend nothing happened while I fumed in the corner? No thanks. By the time the house was empty, I was left standing in my kitchen, staring at a table full of untouched food. The silence was deafening. I thought I'd feel triumphant, like I had stood up for myself, but instead, I felt this overwhelming emptiness. I had worked so hard to create this perfect day, and now it was ruined. Later that evening, my mom called. She didn't yell, but her disappointment was clear. "You overreacted," she said. "You let a few dumb comments ruin the whole day." I tried to explain how hurt and disrespected I felt, but she just sighed and said, "You should have ignored it." That's what I do. Now, sitting here with a fridge full of food and no appetite, I'm wondering if she's right. Did I overreact? Should I have just let it go? Or was I justified in standing up for myself and my home? Update 1. The day after Thanksgiving was supposed to be my day of recovery. I had envisioned spending it in my pajamas, maybe rewatching a comforting show, and slowly working my way through the mountain of leftovers in my fridge. After the debacle the day before, I was emotionally drained. I wasn't just disappointed, I was hurt. I'd worked so hard to make the holiday special, and instead, it had turned into a battlefield. My family had left me feeling small and unappreciated in my own home, and I wasn't exactly eager to see or hear from any of them anytime soon. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee, the warmth of it soothing my frazzled nerves, when there was a knock at the door. At first, I froze. It was early, maybe just after 9 a.m., and I wasn't expecting anyone. I thought about ignoring it, but the knocking came again, more insistent this time. With a sigh, I set my mug down and shuffled to the door, still in my oversized sweatshirt and slippers. When I pulled it open, my heart sank. It was my uncle. I stood there for a moment, stunned. He wasn't the kind of person to drop by unannounced, especially not the day after being thrown out of my house. But there he was, standing on my porch with his hands shoved into the pockets of his coat, looking entirely too pleased with himself. I managed to stammer out something along the lines of, "What are you doing here?" but it didn't seem to faze him in the slightest. He smirked, he always smirks, and said, "Well, since you kicked me out yesterday, I figured I'd come back today to finish what I didn't get to finish." I stared at him, completely dumbfounded. Finish what? Was he serious? For a split second, I thought maybe he was there to apologize, though that idea was quickly dashed when he stepped past me and into my house without waiting for an invitation. The audacity left me speechless. He didn't seem to notice, or care, that I was standing there frozen in shock. He shrugged off his coat, draped it over the back of one of my dining chairs like he owned the place, and started looking around as if he was expecting breakfast to be laid out for him. It took me a moment to gather myself, the initial shock of seeing him standing there still lingering like a cold draft through the open door. My mind was racing, a swirl of disbelief and simmering anger, but I managed to snap into action. When I finally shut the door, the sound was sharper than I intended, the kind of slam that echoed through the quiet house. I turned to face him, my posture stiff, and my voice sharp as I told him he needed to leave immediately. I didn't want company, and I especially didn't want him. I could feel the heat rising to my face as I spoke, my frustration and disbelief bubbling just beneath the surface. But he didn't even flinch. Instead, he waved me off with a dismissive flick of his hand, the kind of gesture that made my blood pressure spike. He acted as though my words didn't matter, as though I was just being dramatic, and he was above it all. "I didn't get to eat anything yesterday, thanks to you," he said, his tone heavy with exaggerated annoyance. My jaw dropped, and for a second, I genuinely thought I might have misheard him. Was he seriously here, standing in my house uninvited, to complain about not eating? Did he think he could just waltz in the day after the disaster he helped cause and demand food like nothing had happened? The sheer audacity of it was almost laughable, if it hadn't made me so furious. I felt my chest tighten as I tried to process what was happening. My voice was colder now, more clipped, as I told him flat out that he wasn't getting anything from me. Not a plate, not a scrap, nothing. I wasn't going to reward his behavior, and I sure as hell wasn't going to let him dig through my fridge after the way he treated me yesterday. I told him he needed to leave, that he wasn't welcome here, but my words seemed to roll right off him like water off a duck's back. Instead of taking me seriously, he laughed. It wasn't a warm laugh or even a polite chuckle, it was that low, condescending laugh he does when he thinks he's smarter or more justified than everyone else in the room. It was the kind of laugh that made my fists clench at my sides, the kind that made me want to scream. He leaned against the back of one of my dining chairs like he had all the time in the world, crossing his arms and settling in as if he owned the place. The casualness of it all was infuriating, as though my anger and my boundaries were nothing more than a minor inconvenience to him. And then he started talking, lecturing me, really, like I was some petulant child who didn't understand the true meaning of Thanksgiving. He launched into this ridiculous spiel about how selfish I was being, how Thanksgiving was about family and sharing what you have, and how I was apparently the greediest person he'd ever met for not letting him have some food. He even had the audacity to say that I'd ruined the holiday for everyone, not just by kicking people out but by refusing to make it right now. His words were dripping with self-righteousness, like he truly believed he was in the right, and I was the one being unreasonable. I stood there, staring at him, utterly incredulous. This grown man, who had mocked me in my own home and contributed to ruining my carefully planned Thanksgiving, was now accusing me of being selfish and greedy. The sheer entitlement of it was almost too much to wrap my head around. For a moment, I couldn't even speak. My mind was racing, replaying every snide comment he'd made the day before, every moment he had laughed at my expense, and now here he was, acting like the victim. The gall, the nerve, the complete lack of self-awareness, it was staggering. But then the anger kicked in. The disbelief melted away, replaced by a burning frustration that made my voice shake as I finally spoke. I told him in no uncertain terms that I didn't owe him anything. Not an apology, not food, nothing. I reminded him of how he had disrespected me in my own home, how he had contributed to ruining the holiday for me, and how he had no right to stand there and act like I was the problem. My words were sharp and pointed, and I didn't hold back. I wanted him to feel every ounce of the frustration and hurt he had caused me. The argument went back and forth for what felt like an eternity. He kept insisting that I was overreacting, that it wasn't a big deal, that it was just a little food. But for me, it wasn't just about the food. It was about the principle, about the utter lack of respect he had shown me, not just the day before but right now, standing here and demanding something he had no right to. I was furious, not just at him but at myself for letting him get under my skin again. I couldn't believe I was wasting my morning on this nonsense. I stood there for a long time after he left, my heart pounding and my hands shaking. I felt a mix of anger, disbelief, and exhaustion. How could someone be so entitled, so completely lacking in self-awareness? I replayed the whole interaction in my head, trying to make sense of it, but the more I thought about it, the more absurd it seemed. He had actually shown up to my house, uninvited, to demand food, and then had the audacity to call me selfish when I refused. Update 2. That afternoon, after my uncle's unannounced and infuriating visit, I tried to shake off the encounter. I told myself I wasn't going to let him ruin the rest of my day. I put on some music, busied myself cleaning up the kitchen, and tried to channel my lingering frustration into productivity. But no matter how hard I tried, his entitled behavior and the ridiculous accusations he hurled at me kept replaying in my mind. I was still fuming about it when my phone buzzed with a notification. At first, I ignored it, figuring it was just a news alert or some junk email. But the buzzing didn't stop. My phone kept lighting up with new notifications, one after the other, and curiosity finally got the better of me. I grabbed my phone and saw that the family group chat, usually a sleepy mix of forwarded memes and occasional birthday wishes, was suddenly blowing up with activity. My stomach dropped. What now? When I opened the chat, my jaw nearly hit the floor. There, in the middle of the thread, was a message from my uncle. It was a long, self-righteous rant that started with, "I just want everyone to know what happened when I went to her house today to try and make things right." My eyes widened as I read on. He had completely flipped the narrative, painting himself as the victim and me as some kind of ungrateful, selfish villain. According to him, he had come over, out of the kindness of his heart, to apologize for the misunderstanding and clear the air, but I had refused to listen and had rudely kicked him out without even giving him a chance to explain. I could feel my blood boiling as I read the rest of his message. He went on to call me selfish and accused me of holding a grudge over a little family disagreement, as if I was the one who had made everything awkward and tense. To make matters worse, he ended his message by saying, "I just hope everyone else in this family can learn to show a little more grace and forgiveness, unlike some people." The audacity was off the charts. What really shocked me, though, was the reaction from the rest of the family. They started chiming in almost immediately, offering their support for him. My aunt commented that it was such a shame how divided the family had become and that she admired my uncle for trying to extend an olive branch. Another cousin said something about how family should always come first and how disappointing it was to see people holding on to anger. Even my mom, who had been somewhat sympathetic to me the day before, added a message saying, "We all need to work on being more understanding." I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It felt like a coordinated attack, a barrage of misplaced sympathy for the man who had single-handedly ruined Thanksgiving and then had the nerve to show up at my house demanding leftovers. My hands were shaking as I read the messages, not from sadness but from pure rage. How could they not see through him? How could they believe his version of events without even asking for my side? I felt like I was losing my mind. But then, I remembered something. My heart rate slowed, and a small, vindicated smile crept onto my face as I opened my phone's camera roll. When my uncle had shown up earlier, I had been so annoyed and caught off guard that I had instinctively hit record on my phone. I'd propped it up on the counter behind a cookbook, capturing the entire encounter just in case something like this happened. And now, I had undeniable proof of everything he had said and done, the dismissive attitude, the entitlement, the accusations, and, most importantly, his real reason for coming over, to demand food. Without hesitating, I uploaded the video to the family group chat. No captions, no explanations, just the raw footage. My hands were still shaking, but this time it wasn't from anger, it was from the anticipation of watching the truth come to light. I hit send and waited. It didn't take long. The typing indicators popped up almost immediately, first from one family member, then another, and another. Then, the messages started pouring in. At first, there was stunned silence, a pause in the chat as everyone watched the video. Then, the reactions started trickling in. "Oh my God, is he serious? Wow, this is embarrassing. Did he really just show up to beg for food after everything?" One by one, my family began to see my uncle for who he really was. The tone of the chat shifted completely. Suddenly, the same people who had been singing his praises were calling him out. My cousin wrote, "Gluttony at its finest, uncle." My aunt chimed in with, "I can't believe you tried to twist this story. Shameful." Even my mom, who had been so quick to suggest I overreacted, added a comment saying, "This is not the apology you made it sound like. You owe her an actual apology." The best part? They didn't hold back, not even a little. The messages poured in, one after another, each more biting than the last. Someone joked, "Was the man starving? He acted like he hadn't eaten in weeks." It was a perfectly timed jab that had the chat lighting up with laughing emojis. Another cousin, who was usually quiet and avoided family drama, chimed in with surprising boldness, saying, "Honestly, if he was that desperate, there's a McDonald's down the street. Maybe they're more forgiving than my name." The quips kept coming, each one a little sharper, a little funnier, and I could feel the tide turning in my favor. The laughter in the chat was relentless. People who rarely interacted were suddenly bonding over my uncle's absurdity, taking turns roasting his behavior. One relative even created a meme with his name on it, overlaying a stock photo of someone hungrily eyeing a refrigerator, captioned, "When you ruin Thanksgiving but still want leftovers." It was the kind of humor that's brutal because it's true, and it spread through the group like wildfire. Every new notification brought a fresh wave of giggles from me, a release of all the frustration I had been bottling up. For the first time in 2 days, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The validation was like a warm blanket, wrapping me up in the knowledge that I wasn't crazy for being angry, and I wasn't alone in seeing how outrageous his behavior had been. My uncle, who had spent so much time being smug and self-assured, was now the butt of every joke in the family chat, and it was glorious. But, predictably, he wasn't about to go down without a fight. His responses started pouring in, each one more defensive than the last. First, he claimed the video was taken out of context, as if there was some magical missing footage that would justify him barging into my house and demanding food. He insisted that it wasn't as bad as it looked and that I had been waiting for a chance to make him look bad. His attempts to spin the situation were as weak as they were desperate, and they only made things worse. The group wasn't buying it. Someone immediately replied, out of context. "Bro, it's a full video. What's missing? You walking in and eating her lunch too?" The comment sent the chat into another uproar, with people piling on to poke holes in his excuses. Every attempt he made to salvage his dignity was met with more laughter and sarcasm. When he claimed he was there to apologize, but got frustrated because I wouldn't listen, another cousin shot back, "Apologize for what? Being hungry? Because that's all I heard in that video." By this point, the damage was done. The video had spoken for itself, and no amount of backtracking or creative storytelling could save him. The more he tried to defend himself, the more ridiculous he sounded, and the group wasn't letting him off the hook. It was almost sad to watch, but then I'd remember how smug he had been, how he'd laughed at me and called me selfish in my own home, and any sympathy I might have felt vanished. His silence, when it finally came, was deafening. After one last weak attempt at justifying his behavior, something about how family should be more forgiving, he stopped replying altogether. The chat slowed down too, the laughter tapering off as people moved on with their day, but the damage to his pride lingered in the messages for everyone to see. For once, my uncle had no way to spin the narrative, no one left to back him up. All he had was the humiliation of being exposed for exactly what he was, gluttonous, entitled, and completely out of line. By the time the dust settled, my uncle had gone completely silent in the chat. He didn't respond to the barrage of jokes and criticism, and eventually, he just stopped reading the messages altogether. Meanwhile, I sat back with a sense of satisfaction, watching as my family rallied around me, finally seeing the truth for themselves. It wasn't the outcome I had expected, but it was exactly what I needed. For once, justice was served, just not the kind of serving my uncle had been hoping for.